24 debate. We've been discussing the recent threats made by Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz, a tiny stretch of water between Oman and Iran. 40% of the world's oil transits through that waterway, prompting immediate reaction by the United States Navy in the region that it would not allow the strait to be closed. Now, the guests I have with me this evening, Trita Parsi in Washington, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. And Trita, you're also the author of A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. When does that come out, Trita?
It's actually out already. You can order it on Amazon.
Oh, it's out already. Okay, I thought it was early 2012. You can already order it. We also have with us Francis Perrin, who's the editorial manager for the bi-monthly magazine Arab Oil and Gas. Thanks for being with us. To my left, Hall Gardner, professor and chair at the Department of International Politics at the American University of Paris. And it's worth noting that Hall wrote a book called Averting Global War. As we were saying earlier, it came out 2 years ago, but it's still relevant to what's going on now. There's a full chapter in there devoted to Iran. Thanks for being with us as well. And Borzu Daragahi is also listening to us. He's in Cairo. Borzu, you're the Financial Times correspondent in Cairo. You're obviously a regular contributor to France 24. Our viewers know you, and you worked for a long time as correspondent in Iran. So thanks for joining the conversation. I want to start the second part of this debate by asking Francis just how affected is the Iranian economy by the sanctions, the various rounds of sanctions that have been imposed by the international community. And just as a reminder to our viewers, the United Nations Security Council has imposed 4 rounds of sanctions. The United States, Canada, and the European Union have their own sanctions, which go even further, and they're getting ready to impose even more. We were just discussing that at the end of part 1 of the debate. The U.S. is getting ready to essentially exclude the Iranian central bank from the world financial system, and the European Union is going to decide at the beginning of next month whether or not to boycott Iranian crude oil. This all begs the question, if we've been imposing sanctions, the West has been imposing sanctions on Iran for years, does it work? What effect is it having?
Well, UN sanctions are not very important. They are politically important, of course, but they do not weigh very much in economic terms as they are structured up to now due to disagreements within the UN Security Council. The US has sanctioned globally Iran for about 30 years. In terms of oil and economic terms globally. What is really important is what is happening now and what will probably happen in the next few weeks. Because now Western countries are focusing on 2 very important fields for Iran, oil and energy, but it means especially oil, of course, for Iran, and finance. We spoke about the recent decision by the US Congress about the Central Bank of Iran, but very recently the United Kingdom.
The decision, by the way, would penalize foreign companies that deal with the Iranian Central Bank, which would be a big blow to their economy because a lot of the oil that is bought from Iran, the money is paid through the Central Bank.
You have, of course, the oil sector, which is the key sector for Iran. The finance sector is very important, and you have the links between oil and finance. So we are really at the heart of what could hurt the Iranian economy. And the Iranian leaders are, well, they are saying every day 2 contradictory things. First, they say Iran there will be no negative impact because of all your sanctions. It's bullshit. And they say at the same time, if you add new sanctions, we will block the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, it's clear that they are very much concerned. For the private sector in Iran, it becomes more and more difficult to do business with the rest of the world. Iran say, well, if I cannot sell my oil to Europe, I will sell it to Asia. But Asia is already buying about 45% of Iranian oil exports.
Iran sells much of its oil to China, but not only China, also India, Japan, South Korea.
Yes. But if you take Asia outside OECD, so outside Japan, It's about over the first 7 months of this year, 2011, Asia, non-OECD Asia is about 45% of Iranian oil exports. So it's very important, but it's very dubious that China and India will double their imports of Iranian crude oil. It's not in their interest. So they will have difficulty finding some replacements for if there is an embargo by the European Union, and let's say the European OECD countries. It's about 30% of Iranian crude imports, so it's important. And of course, they will ask some rebates on the sale of Iranian oil. So it will definitely hurt Iran, even if the game of the authorities is to deter Europe from taking sanction. It will have not impact on the economy, but it's totally false.
But hold on, you have underlined for us the importance, the impact that these sanctions can have, and the importance of the sale of oil to the Iranian economy. So, Borzu, what I'm wondering now is, if the sale of Iranian oil is what's propping up the Iranian economy, why on earth would they threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz and therefore shoot themselves in the foot?
Well, I think the threat was that either if the West sets up a system whereby they can no longer sell their oil, or they attack Iran, then they will close the Strait of Hormuz. I.e., if you impose an existential threat against the Iranian regime, then we will close the Strait of Hormuz and basically take the whole ship down with us. And so I think that if Iran is able to find mechanisms to sell its oil to India and Asia and other parts of the world, they will definitely not close the Strait of Hormuz. However, if the U.S. is successful in getting the world to stop buying Iranian oil, then they will, that is the threat at least, then they will try to close the Strait of Hormuz.
All right, so the Iranians are saying, let us be part of the commercial game, let us sell our oil. If we can't do it, you can't do it either.
I mean, that's what they're saying. Whether they're capable of following through on that technically is another question, and whether they're willing to take that gambit and risk the degradation of their military forces by incurring a U.S. military response are another couple of questions.
Trita Parsi in Washington, where do you see this going?
Well, I mean, first I'll just make a comment on this previous. We are in a negative-sum dynamic here. You asked, why would the Iranians do something that would hurt themselves? Well, everyone is doing something that is hurting themselves. The Europeans are imposing sanctions on the Iranians that are hurting the EU economies as well, but the hope is that it will hurt the Iranian economy far more. Same thing is with the United States. The United States has completely eliminated all the trade that it had, which at one point in 1993 stood at $4 billion a year. It's all eliminated at this point. We're hurting ourselves on all sides right now, and unfortunately it seems to be getting worse. What is important to note, though, is we are not in a situation in which one can make the argument that war is inevitable. It is not inevitable. Unfortunately, structurally, we are driving towards a war right now. But if diplomacy is pursued in a much more serious and persistent manner, this conflict can be avoided and some sort of a resolution can be found. But we've never really had that type of diplomacy. We've had some limited, very genuine attempts at diplomacy, but these diplomatic efforts did not fail. They were essentially prematurely abandoned. And that's why we are in this dynamic right now.
I'd like to follow up on that, and that's where my analogy to the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, the hostage crisis comes into play, because the Carter administration did engage in secret diplomacy finally to get the hostages out. Now, in my view, we're in a bigger crisis than that, but of course Americans were at stake, but the Iranians never really understood the psychological impact that that hostage taking took. But the point is that there was secret diplomacy that went on behind the scenes and successfully got the hostages out, of course, with Ronald Reagan taking credit for it rather than Jimmy Carter. But what worries me in this case is that, just was what I said before, is we have not engaged, we don't have the channels to really engage secretly, or don't seem to have them, or seem to have closed some of them off, and therefore, and Obama's got to do this by November. At the same time, the Republicans and others are going to be jumping on his throat, making him engage in a tougher policy. And so it's a really fine, it's going to be a very fine rope to travel over the next several months to get out of this crisis. I agree that war is not inevitable, but we are making it more likely.
So what you're essentially saying, Hol, is that the stage is set for an escalation of the confrontation, or rather of the tension in the rhetoric?
I can't see any way out because there's an election dynamic. The warships are all in place. Both sides have been threatening the alliance system that Syria is crumbling. That was Iran's main ally. There's all the Saudis are trying to block them from influence in Bahrain or Yemen, and prevent them from influencing eastern Saudi Arabia, where a large Shiite community is. The dynamics are very strong for further conflict.
Well, so you see the negative dynamics, the escalating. Listen to the sound of the street, if you will, in Tehran, where these are ordinary people, not officials, several of whom seem to be on a war footing. They're preparing for another armed confrontation with the United States. Let's take a listen.
جنگ چیز خوبی نی ولی خب اگه اتفاق بیفته شرکت میکنه 100%.
Now, Borzu Daragahi in Cairo, you won't have been able to hear actually some of this because it was subtitled. But these are people
I saw the
who are...
subtitles.
Excuse me?
He saw the subtitles.
Oh, you saw the subtitles.
I saw it,
All right.
yeah.
Based on your experience reporting in Iran, is this rhetoric normal?
No, I would take that kind of footage with a grain of salt in a country like Iran, especially given what has happened in the last couple years there with regard to the crackdown. But one thing I would note, I think we've been pretty harsh on the U.S. for its failure to reach out diplomatically to Iran. I think that it's also important to note that Iran its diplomatic behavior has been horrendous, and that is not necessarily the way that Iran's diplomatic corps has worked in the past. It's gotten a lot worse over the last 5 or 6 years. Their ability to reach out to other countries, the quality of the diplomats that they've had in key positions, they are at least 50% to blame for the failure of any kind of diplomatic rapprochement between the West and Iran. And I have it on very good authority that when the Obama administration, offered this now, long forgotten deal whereby they would take some of Iran's nuclear enriched material out of the country and bring back fuel rods for a medical reactor. There was a lot of potentially great offers in that package for Iran, and many people in the Iranian diplomatic community and the political establishment were in favor of this package, but the hardliners prevailed, and this deal went nowhere. So I think that that pressure should be brought also on the Iranian political establishment to prevent this whole situation from escalating any further.
Well, I suppose...
If I could just say something on that, to echo what Borzu was saying, I think we have seen over the course of the last couple of years a deterioration of Iranian statecraft, and you're seeing a situation in which their ability to even make decisions seems to have been significantly compromised, and that has made diplomacy much, much more difficult, and the Iranians have missed numerous opportunities. But what I think is clear on both sides is that the political space for pursuing diplomacy, both in Tehran and in Washington, is very limited, and we have not seen any politicians on either side that is willing to go out there and actually push to create more space for that type of an option. You have elements and persons who have at points tried diplomacy, but they've done so without creating more political space for themselves. And in a conflict that essentially has lasted 3 decades, you cannot resolve it by operating within the existing political space for diplomacy. You have to expand it, and neither side has been able to do that.
Trita, I've been listening to what you've been saying since the beginning of the debate, and one of your answers earlier sparked a question. You said both sides, currently in this dynamic, both sides are essentially trying to hurt each other. And sure, making threats like the one Iran has just made drives up the price of oil, and that plays into Iran's hands. Fine. But we've also established that the economic sanctions have had a significant impact on Iran, and the international community, in particular the European Union and the United States, are poised to take even harsher measures against Iran. The question is this: can Iran survive this next round of sanctions that appears to be coming? Medium term.
If you take a look at other cases in which these type of crippling sanctions have been imposed, particularly when they have been non-democracies, unfortunately, they have managed to survive. Just take a look at what happened in Iraq. In the Iraqi case, you had a complete oil embargo. You didn't even have a situation in which the Iraqis could continue to sell oil to the Russians and the Chinese. It was complete. But Saddam Hussein did not his regime did not collapse. On the contrary, he remained firmly in power. The joke in the Security Council back in the late 1990s was that the last chicken sandwich in Iraq would always be eaten by Saddam Hussein, because he would always be able to find something to eat, whereas the rest of the population would suffer. So there's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that even though these type of sanctions are tremendously devastating, it does not mean that a government that is not democratic will not be able to withstand them and survive, even though it may lead to the complete collapse of the rest of the economy. The people in power will still be in power.
So you're saying ordinary Iranians might not be able to survive the next train of sanctions, but the regime will.
The main victims of these sanctions have been and will continue to be ordinary Iranians, of which I would say a very large majority are opposed to the government in Iran. But they're the primary victims of these sanctions policies.
All right, Trita Parsi, that was the final word. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining us for this debate. Trita Parsi in Washington, Francis Perrin, Hall Gardner, and Boris Udaragahi in Cairo. Thank you all. And thanks to our viewers for watching the debate. Obviously, Iran is a major issue which France 24 will continue to follow. We'll be bringing you the news and the developments after these threats made by Tehran in the coming days. Coming up right now is Business News with Marcus Carson. Bye-bye.